Hi, welcome to Chapter and Verse. Today I'm going to have a marvelous conversation with Mark Gottlieb, who is one of the top agents at the Trident Media Group, and he'll be talking about his experiences as an agent, and he'll be talking to authors and giving advice if you're an author about what should work and what may not work when you're submitting to agents and other things. So be sure to stay for the entire conversation. You're going to learn a lot. And at the end, Mark's going to give us his #1 tip for aspiring writers. I'm Rick Bleiweiss. I'm an award-winning author, and my historical fiction, Mystery, Pignon Scorpion, and the Barbershop Detectives publishes next February. And that is enough about me. Hi, Mark.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here. It's really good to see you. And I'm so glad we're speaking, because we've known each other for such a long time. We've worked together for such a long time. And I think it's so cool what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I've appeared in your blog. So, I think what we're both doing is very cool. So
I wish I was as technologically savvy. I've got to get on it, start some kind of vlog or something.
Well, it doesn't take a ton, but yeah, it helps to, But let's start though. I'm not sure that everybody that will be watching this is as familiar with Trident Media Group as I am. So why don't you just talk a little bit about the company and tell people what you think they should know about it.
Okay. Well, Trident Media Group is a literary agency in New York City. We happen to be one of book publishing's largest, most diversified literary agencies. We typically lead the publishing industry in number of deals and amount of money for deals every year consecutively, since they started tracking this stuff like back in 2004. So for a very long time. And you'll find a whole mixture of authors, from #1 New York Times bestselling authors to Pulitzer Prize winning authors, you name it. And we do a range of work from, work with traditional print books, audiobooks, ebooks, foreign rights for books in translation, even some book to film and TV. So that's us.
Cool. How many agents work there?
So I think we are probably somewhere around a dozen agents or so. And so for a literary agency, that's probably very big, because in most cases, like a talent agency might have like a literary department with a small handful of agents in the department, but we are really devoted to authors and their books and all of the manifestations a book can take.
Great. So how did you personally get to be an agent? Were you a writer first, or were you always wanted to be an agent? I know you grew up in that environment. So
yeah, I grew up in like a book publishing house, you could say, because both my parents worked in publishing, and so I was always around books and authors and creative people, storytelling people all the time, and it became just very second nature to me. I couldn't see, I grew up in a town. It was a fairly affluent town, and a lot of my friends went on to be, doctors and lawyers and things like that. And I couldn't see myself doing that. Even though they probably make a nice, comfortable living, I wanted to feel personally enriched. And I felt like books do that in a lot of ways. They make us into better people, really.
I agree. They do. I'm familiar with your dad, who owns Trident, but I was not familiar with the fact that your mother was also in publishing.
Yeah, so my dad owns the company where I work. He's the chairman there. For a long time, he ran the literary department at the William Morris Agency, and then effectively took the department with him when he started Trident. And my mom worked for a time in publishing. She even spent time as an English teacher, but she mostly worked in the space of like contracts, business affairs contracts, and now has sort of winded a lot of that back. Yeah, that was the home I grew up in. So my parents were always pushing books on me, but it was a good thing.
It was a very good thing. Well, from my experience with you, I know, and with your authors that you represent that have, signed to Blackstone, I know you have a great relationship with them. And is the author agent relationship what you like best about the job, or do you like the thrill of the hunt of submissions, or what do you like best about being an agent?
Well, yeah, it is very exciting. Like you say, when a project connects in a big and meaningful way, like there are certain authors I have with, the publishing company where you're also at Blackstone. And I love it when other people see what I also see in a book. And that's always very exciting to help bring something to the world. And I love the cover design process. I think that's so neat how different people interpret the story in the same way. They might take a certain element and want to put it on the cover, and sometimes they're bright and vibrant. Obviously, you can't judge a book by its cover, like they say, but
Right.
it's a fun process. Um, yeah, I mean, and just being around interesting, creative people, no one day is the same. Every day is different, which is really good if you're trying to just avoid monotony. So
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, no 2 days are alike. You're absolutely right, which is a really wonderful thing.
yeah.
So, how many authors do you represent at any given time, you personally?
So me personally, among my client list, there's probably a few dozen authors, but they are always going to be at probably different stages in their career. So as you probably know, there could be authors they might write one book their entire life, or maybe they're writing one or two books a year, which is kind of a nice pace if you want to make it a commercially viable thing and you have an ongoing series or something like that. And then other authors, they might write a book every 10 years or so. And when they do, it's like a big event.
Right.
Everyone had been waiting a very long time. So I would also say, like, to new authors or hopeful writers looking to become published authors, not to necessarily be put off by a big client list, because those authors are at all different stages in their career. The agency as a whole, there's probably over 1,000 authors there, but kind of the same rule applies. And obviously, those authors are spread out among many different agents. Some of those authors are even literary estates. So,
There's I'm pretty active on social media, and there seems to be what I perceive as a misconception that agents and publishers are not looking for debut authors. And I keep countering that by saying debut authors are tomorrow's hit authors. They're the lifeblood of any agent or any publisher. And I'm just wondering what your comment and take would be to that. It just seems to be pervasive that there seems to be a lot of people under that misconception that nobody wants to sign a new author.
everyone has to get their start somewhere. So every author you see today who's a bestseller began as a debut author. That's always going to be inevitable. And, as those authors, grow and move in different ways, then people need to come about and take their place. I don't think forever Stephen King and Dean Koontz will have a stranglehold on the horror genres. There are some young up and coming voices too in that space. What I think is going on with debut fiction, which is really peculiar, is for a very long time, publishers were buying more debut fiction,
Right.
but they weren't paying as much. And it was sort of expected that, okay, it's a debut. We don't know how this is going to go, but publishers were usually open to it, as they still are now to a certain extent, because they look at it and they say, this author won't have any publishing baggage with them. There's a 50-50 chance with them. There's nothing prior to evaluate them on. The retailers can't say, well, we're not going to order that many copies, because the retailers don't have any sales history to go on. So that's always kind of been a good thing for debut authors. It's a fresh start. Obviously, the sophomore book is always harder, or as you go along, you've got to kind of keep up that momentum or have a publisher willing to invest book to book. And there are some authors who, like Terry Pratchett, he had a long running series that didn't take off until like the seventh book or something.
Right.
But someone was believing in him along the way. What's happened today that's different is publishers have become so peculiar about debut fiction that what's happened is they were betting on these literary kind of debut authors who they thought they could put a ton of money on, and kind of like betting on horses, one of them will kind of break away from the pack and run across the finish line, but it's not really a viable business. It's kind of like, you know, if you read in the news this morning, there's this kind of Bitcoin where they put some fake news on Twitter about Target being willing to accept a certain Bitcoin, and the company had to disavow that. The stock shot up 25%, which was great for people who held it, but then, you know, or sold it in time. But then the people who came in at the wrong time and bought the stock, you know, after the news, the stock went back down. So they experienced a lot of volatility. And so it's kind of the same thing in the debut fiction space. There's a lot of hype around literary fiction and debut authors because it goes back to that old adage of there's no book publishing baggage. It's just, this is good writing.
Right.
So the publishers, they overpay. And what happens is most of it doesn't pan out. And it puts a terrible burden on authors because if the first book doesn't perform well, you know this from the publishing side. Actually, you have a very unique view at both as an author and publisher.
Right.
So you can see it from both sides. But basically, it makes doing the second book really difficult for publishers. So it's just a lot of pressure on authors in that space. And as the agent or the author, you have to think, well, where's the next debut coming from? Or what do we do with the second book?
Right.
So it makes it very difficult sometimes. Hopefully it works out. We always want it to work out, but it doesn't always work out.
Right. So, you know, you were talking about like sophomore books and things. So what's easier to sell if you're an agent, a single book by a new debut author, or if they've written a book that's the start of a series where you're actually looking for the publisher to maybe to commit to 2 or 3 books, but you can see series potential as opposed to a single standalone?
I remember when publishers were buying, you know, 5 books from an author, regardless of whether they were a debut or they were all, a series or standalone novels. Now I'm seeing more publishers, you know, doing, you know, 1 or 2 books on a contract. If the author is lucky, you know, they get 2 or 3 books on a contract. And usually the publisher wants, I'm finding, to do them as standalones because for 2 reasons. One is historically with series, like the readership is always having to catch up. And you can see that sometimes it's hard to sustain that, especially as series get much longer than 2 or 3 books. And then I think the other issue is if a publisher is committed to a series and God forbid the series doesn't live up to the publisher's expectations, it's hard to, you know, kind of to change tracks. They're like already shoehorned into a series. So I find that a lot of publishers, it's kind of a weird way of going about it, but they want to buy like a bunch of standalones, and then what they do with the standalones is if one of them breaks away in a big way, breaks out in a big way, they build it into a series if they're able to.
Right. Okay. Cool. So, are there specific genres that you as an agent prefer to acquire over others? I mean, I know good writing is good writing, but you know, not everybody is a total generalist, and there are specialist agents. And I'm just wondering, in terms of you, what do you prefer?
You know, I never wanted to limit myself just because I've seen even with colleagues of mine who, you know, have said, well, I'm the de facto, you know, women's fiction agent, and I only want to do romance and erotica type books. And so there was a big boom for a while in erotica, unintended. And with authors like Sylvia Day and E.L. James, and then it, like the dot-com bubble, it just suddenly went away. And so if you were going around for a while and saying, "Oh, I'm just doing romance and erotica," then what were you going to do at that point? That was your roster of authors. So I never wanted that to be the problem for me. And so I always had wide interests. I mean, my home is kind of eclectic too. So, you know, I thought I should do a bunch of different things between fiction, nonfiction, children's books, and graphic novels. I don't know if there's really a commonality there, but in things like the nonfiction, I tend to find, obviously the platform-driven nonfiction does really well.
Right.
If it's a celebrity-based book, and any author that has a big following in that space. I've done a lot of, mostly in that space, some business books, some celebrity books, and in the fiction space, I would say a mixture of, commercial fiction and upmarket fiction, which is that kind of crossroads of where literary fiction meets commercial fiction. And then, the occasional children's picture book, the occasional middle grade or young adult. And I love graphic novels. I think it's a great new space in publishing. It's actually one of the fastest growing spaces in publishing. So it's an exciting area to be in.
So how different is dealing with graphic novels from dealing with just print books with no pictures, if you will? I mean, I think it's an entirely different audience to a great degree. And is it a whole different process as an agent?
Early on, it was frustrating because I knew for a long time that graphic novels were going to be a big thing, that, publishers, it was just a matter of time until they fully got on the bandwagon. Until then, it's like they viewed the old Superman and Batman and Spider-Man comics. They would look at it and they say, is this a magazine? Is this a superhero thing? And it's a medium, it's not a genre, it's a medium. And so it's really whatever a storyteller can make of it. And what's great about graphic novels is it works so well in the school and library market because it's a teaching companion for teachers, certainly if there's a graphic novel adaptation of a book. And then, nowadays, like, even I think in my generation, there were parents who wanted to take comic books away from kids.
Right.
Now they're trying to get kids off the iPad. If they could just get them to read a comic book, they would be happy.
Right.
So I think that's just a big part of it. It's catering to people's shortened attention spans, but it's also just a nice medium in and of itself too. Yeah.
Cool. So let me ask you about query letters. What would be your advice to an aspiring author in terms of what kind of a query letter they should craft that would get someone like you interested? Because I'm sure, you could correct me if I'm wrong, you get a stack of query letters like that, and you've got to go through them and go, this one interests me, this doesn't. So what talk about the process. What interests you? How many do you get? It's an interesting area.
There are probably hundreds of query letters coming into the agency a day. Across all the other agents. And sometimes they kind of come in seasons. There's sort of an ebb and flow. You can tell, like in the summertime when people can take their sabbatical,
right?
It's like there's a big influx of them. But I think, there's so many things you can do wrong with a query letter. I always say that it's much easier to just focus in on what's done right in a query letter. And I think, just to really boil it down, I think a good query letter, it fits all on one page. And I think the first paragraph should really grab someone's attention. It should have the hook, maybe a couple of which is the quick pitch, have a couple of comparative or competitive titles that the author's feels some way similar to their book. And then like a couple body paragraphs, a textual description, like what the story is like, kind of like what you would see on the back of a book. You've
Right.
got plenty of examples behind you. That's what an author could do. They could pull a book off the shelf, get a feel for it, or even reading the product pages online. And then the last paragraph, I think, is best left to like an author bio of relevant writing experience and credentials. I think that's a pretty easy way to disseminate information. You know, it takes a thought process out of it if authors go about it in that way. But most of all, and this goes to the heart of everything you and I do, it's got to be well written.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's what is your first opportunity to showcase your work. If it's well written, story sounds exciting, there's a good chance I'll want to then request the manuscript.
So if I was a debut aspiring author and sent my query letter to you, you would be more than likely to look at the query letter, but then you decide whether or not you're interested in following up on it or not. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, what I do in query letters is, you know, I go a few lines into the letter. If it's good, you know, I continue. If it's well written, the story sounds exciting, I continue. And then especially if the author has really good writing credentials, you know, that's also another great indicator to me. And then from there, yeah, I would request the manuscript. But otherwise, there's no time to read hundreds of letters all the way through. So that's why you got to kind of it's like you got to be a shock jock in a way. You got to just excite people right away. I heard a story once, like there was an author who had written a book about basketball and he was having trouble getting the attention of publishers. He got so frustrated. He went out, bought a bunch of basketballs, took a black Sharpie marker and hand wrote his query letter on the basketball. I wouldn't recommend this today, but he mailed out basketballs. So people got basketballs in the mail with a query letter. And it got people's attention. Whether or not the book went on to get published or not, I don't know, but it did get people's attention.
Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, I came out of the music industry originally. And the two things that kind of are similar is they always said back in the day, you always opened your single with the hook because you wanted to hook people, you know, and it's like, that's exactly kind of what you're saying. And I remember an incident where we were trying to get a record played on a radio station and we couldn't even get the music director to listen to it. And what we ended up doing was sending him a pizza and we had them write in whipped cream on the pizza the name of the record and it got his attention. So you're right. It's like sometimes just being a little left of center can get attention.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously there are good ways to go about it and there are bad ways, but you know,
yeah.
And there are ways to do that just with the plain writing, obviously, you know, but I think that always helps because I know the experience of other people, like the experience you have, like even in receiving lots of submissions is you get it partway into the letter and you have to decide whether you want to continue on with the letter or not.
Right.
So, yeah.
So no, I know some agents respond to every query letter they get, and other agents respond only to those that they're interested in. What's your style? I don't think there's a right or wrong here. I'm just wondering what your style is.
I think everyone's going to be different with that, but generally, actually, what we do is we prefer to receive query letters through our website. There's a form there we ask people to fill out because we ask them to agree to terms and conditions and things like that. And in doing so, when they fill out the form and put their email address there, it generates an automatic response, basically thanking them for the letter and saying, you know, if we're interested, we'll be in touch within, I forget what it is, 30 or 60 days. So most people can assume that if they haven't heard after a while, you know, maybe they're not interested. But obviously, if we're interested, we will definitely reach out. But either way, that they do get that kind of auto-generated response. I don't know what other people do. But yeah, it's really hard with the amount of, there's only so much time in the world to do this stuff.
I agree. So what would you say, other than writing a really great query letter, and that may be the answer, but is there other advice you'd give to writers who want to get an agent to rep them? Like, how important is their own social media, size and things like that? Are there things that are trigger points, if you will, where you'd go, okay, this would make it easier to get an agent to rep you than not?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the world of nonfiction, an author's platform has always been really, really important because uh, publishers, a couple decades ago or so realized in order to sell books, they need an author who has a built-in audience. And that could mean any number of things, from they have a big social media following to a big newsletter subscriber list, or, they do speaking engagements across the country, in which case, they can be selling their book. And for a very long time in the world of fiction, that rule didn't really apply because, it kind of goes back to the debut author thing. Like, the only thing we can go on is the quality writing. Like, I would be very surprised if a debut author has the kind of following that's expected of a nonfiction author, who's, frankly, they're getting their book published not because of necessarily how good the writing is or what the idea is of what that matters, but who they are. In the world of fiction, some people are looking for that, but I think the way in which it renders out is a lot different, in that it kind of comes down to a lot of the bells and whistles and how much of to use a popular phrase, like how good of a community member they are within the literary community, how tied in they are. And that is what I think kind of amounts to the author platform for an author of fiction. Who are the people who will come together, like whether it be from their MFA program or the conferences and workshops they've attended,
right?
Or, to support the book in a meaningful way. That is, I think, the closest thing that exists for a platform for authors of fiction, and it's starting to matter more to publishers, and by turns agents. So.
Okay, so you brought something up earlier I'd like to go a little further into, and you were talking about how, Trident also has people that do film and TV placement for books and foreign rights. And I know that there are larger agencies, smaller agencies, and agents do different things. So I guess I've kind of got a two-part question. The first part is, at its core, what should an author expect an agent to do for them? Any agent, no matter how big or small the agency. And then I guess part two is, beyond the foreign and the film, are there other things that you think Trident does that many other agents don't do, or there may not be? I don't know. But I think the core of my question is, if I'm an author, a debut author, and what would I expect my agent to do for me?
So what an agent does in their essence, or an agency does in their essence, the hint is in the title of the name. Like, we give authors agency in the world, in the publishing world, in the larger world. We act as their representatives. We advocate on their behalves. We maintain a symbiotic relationship with the author, and basically have a fiduciary responsibility to them. Our work being commission based, it's not like we're a lawyer who has an hourly wage.
Right.
Whether you win the case or lose the case, lawyers getting paid.
Yeah.
And if it's believe it or not, if it's a divorce case, you might be surprised that the two lawyers might go and have dinner and drinks after and laugh about how ridiculous a case that was, because they both got paid.
Right.
So in my line of work, it's different. It's more so like a real estate agent. You don't pay a real estate agent to sell a home for you. They take a commission.
Right.
And so if the author does well, we do well. And if the author doesn't do well, we don't do well. And so we would never do anything to inhibit that, in any way, because it's our lifeblood. Our work depends on it. So that's kind of what an agent is meant to do in their essence. The type of things they do is they help bring an author to a publisher, then in turn to a wider audience. And a big part of that is all of the different manifestations a book can take. It's not just like in the oldest sense of the word, like looking at a physical object of a book.
Right.
You know, audiobooks became a big thing and remain a big thing. Foreign rights for books in translation getting published overseas. And as you mentioned, book to film and TV, which we do a lot of for our clients because, I mean, it's not just a service we do for them. We think it's a viable way to also market and promote the books. So some good recent examples are obviously the Frank Herbert Dune movie. We had put that deal together. Cool. And the House of Gucci movie with, I guess it's Adam Driver, Lady Gaga, there's Jeremy Irons, Al Pacino, a bunch of other people in it. That was based off of another one of our books. And those were backlist titles, so they were previously published books. And there's been a huge uptick in, I mean, these books went right back onto the bestsellers list. They started doing well in all their formats again, generating royalties. So there's a reason why we do this kind of work. However, it's very difficult and arduous work. It takes a long time. It doesn't always connect right away. I mean, you know this in our line of work, there are many even #1 bestselling authors who you wonder why hasn't their work been adapted yet? And sometimes it just takes a long time. But when it happens, it's a pretty good thing. And I would say what sets our work apart from maybe other agencies in this space is most other agents will probably do one of two things. They will maybe give film and TV rights away to a publisher, which really is typically not done in our industry so much, maybe more so at a smaller agency where they're not equipped to help an author properly exploit those rights. Or they might work with an outside company to, like an outside agency in Hollywood to help them place this stuff. Sometimes we do that, but more often than not, we also sell this stuff in-house and go directly to, you know, producers and managers, talent lawyers, studios, and try and get something sold. So we work in a combination of ways. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to add something here that I think you're going to agree with, but you know, and that is, so again, on social media, I see writers talking all the time about different publishers, some who charge them, you know, to print their books for them, and yeah, I know, and kind of vanity press, and others that are this, others that are that. And I would think that one of the main roles of an agent is not just to bring books to publishers, but to know which publishers to bring it to and shield their authors from less either reputable or different types of publishers that may not be in the best interests of their authors.
Yeah, I mean, you know right away if a publisher is charging you to print the book, it's just amounts to a vanity press. And that's going to be second nature to most agents or people working in the publishing industry for a while or publishing for a while. But the internet is full of just scams, misinformation. And so a lot of people fall for it, or it's like a lot of people just, you know, a lot of people sometimes just believe what they see on TV, which is unconscionable to me because frankly, you can't. Right. And even information contained within books, obviously there are a lot of more so I would say than TV, like in journalism, there are a lot of kind of fail safes, you know, people who fact check information, but you can even find misinformation in books. So
yeah, too, you can.
You know, you have to kind of be just discerning with this stuff and think to yourself, like, could that be a scam? Does that feel right to me? And then make it a good and informed decision. The good news about working with an agent or an agency is that they'll know who the major players are in the publishing space, which publishers can make for a good, a happy, a highly successful publishing experience for an author, you know, in a meaningful way. And they'll probably tend to steer authors, you know, away from places like that because typically all that will result in is, first of all, a publisher paying little or no money and not publishing the author in a big or meaningful way. In fact, it can be detrimental to the point where if the book doesn't live up to, better expectations, then it's harder to get the author's next book published.
Right.
So yeah, it can be a bad thing.
I think that's a very important point that you just made, because especially in this day and age where, everybody's looking at what did the last book sell. I'm talking about retailers, both online, brick and mortar, et cetera. It is harder when your first book hasn't done well to get a deal on the second book, because it's harder to get the book to go into bookstores, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, this is all a result of, believe it or not, I think it goes back to the New Deal, where as a part of getting the country back on its feet, they allowed retailers to have something which is called returns, where basically any excess stock that they couldn't sell, the retailers were then able to return it to the publishers, or if they were shoes, the sneaker company, whatever.
Right.
And basically the whoever made the product had to eat that. And nowadays that all factors into what we pay for these things. Okay, it's like probably it contributes to inflation and things like that. So what's happened is that because returns are in place for many, many decades, and bookstores don't want that to go away because it makes their job so easy, they have very little to lose. It puts such a burden on publishers, because they're going to get returns, they're going to receive excess stock, and there's a cost of shipping, warehousing, manufacturing associated with it. Obviously, ebooks and digital audio helps to mitigate a lot of that, but
right.
Print, and there are other formats that are still viable. So it creates some problems. And then on top of it, the retailers say to publishers, we will only order to net on however many copies of an author's last book we sold. So the position that puts the publisher in is, publisher might want to print 50 or 150,000 copies of the book. But if the retailers are telling them, hey, we only sold 5,000 copies the last time around, then guess how many copies the publisher is printing? Yeah. So that also ties into what we were talking about with regard to debut author. When publishers set the bar way too high, it creates unrealistic expectations. It creates volatility in the marketplace, and it makes it very hard for the authors to live up to that success the second time around, especially with the pressure publishers are getting from retailers. So, I think that conversation that's probably going on online among authors, or how difficult it is as a debut author, probably in some way goes back to that. Certainly, if publishers are waking up to the fact that they've been overpaying for these books. Yeah.
What about self-publishing? Do you have I just read something that 1 million books a year are self-published, which is about 2,700 every day. And what I keep telling authors online is, you got to find a way to market your books if you're going to self-publish them, because it's like, how do you see the one tree in the forest, if you will? And I'm just wondering what your view on self-publishing is, and do you represent any authors that were self-published who decided they had some success or not, and then went the trad publishing route?
I think basically it's, self-publishing is very similar to kind of that .com bubble, or probably what people don't realize now with Bitcoin. It's another one of those. You had to be there very early on, I think, and people are waking up to just how volatile the stuff can be. And so, with self-publishing early on, it was very big because there weren't as many players in the space. There weren't as many people self-publishing, and people could be very creative with how they priced their books. And what happened in the self-publishing space was, as you say, the way it is now. There's a glut of material, and it's very difficult to stand out among all that unless you're kind of like a marketing guru. And on top of it, it's a race to the bottom in terms of the pricing of these ebooks. So everyone is selling them for 99 cents. You have to sell a lot of them for that to work. And for authors to make that jump from self-publishing to traditional publishing, they need to have at least been selling at a decent price point, because publishers can't price their books out at that same price. And they need to, on top of it, hope the readership is going to go with the author, and be willing to pay a certain price for the book. So that's a big part of it. There are factors as to why the self-publishing space, ended up that way, which are pretty interesting. But basically, early on, there were a lot of authors who were built out of the self-publishing space into traditional publishing, and it's still happening. I did it recently for a client with, Grand Central, the imprint at Hachette Books, women's fiction book. She obviously not just a good writer, she probably had a whole team of people with her. It's right. That's the thing. It's a big time investment, money investment, because you have to get editors, designers, marketing, publicity people involved. And if it doesn't pan out, then it was a big time and money investment. And if it doesn't do well, and chances are it's very hard to stand out in that space, then it makes my job difficult to sell the book to a publisher. So you really have to be amazing and gung-ho about that for it to make any kind of business sense.
Right. So I know I don't want you to name any publishers in particular. In other words, I'm not looking for comparisons by name, but I'm just wondering in general, what do you deal with a lot of publishers? How do they differ? What do you see as differences between publishers?
Some of it is culture, Penguin Random House is a very data-driven publisher, which I think can oftentimes actually be their undoing, because we don't work in a science lab. We work in book publishing, which is like an art form. And the funny thing is, so many people are swearing by the data, like it's a holy object.
Right.
And frankly, publishing was a better place when people followed their gut instincts. They banked on the author who, it's like with Terry Pratchett, they knew he was going to take off. It was just a matter of time. And so, I'm not too happy that basically these kind of data soothsayers have like the ears of executives at publishing houses, because the data can only tell you so much.
Right.
And the data just can't explain some publishing phenomenons we've had. Right. So that's one thing, the difference between some publishers I see. And then some other differences, submission policies. I'm really only going to name names where it's not, too heavy-handed of things.
Okay.
For instance, at Simon and Schuster, they tend to want to know, is this submission with different editors around the publishing house? And if so, which editors? Because then they confer amongst themselves, because they don't bid against themselves, and they decide who at the company will
look at the book
and decide whether they offer or not. Other publishers, I think it might be the case at HarperCollins, they basically want you to pick one editor, one imprint, you decide, but they're the only person to look at it. And we don't want to send to other editors, which, makes things like threading a needle, And so I really don't know if that's the best method. And then this is where I won't name names or name publishers, but probably, and I hope this is not a commonality among publishers, because I think it's almost like an atrocious thing. But I heard that, oftentimes it goes back to the author sales numbers. When publishers are acquiring a new author, I can't stop them from doing this. And it's not like I encourage publishers to do this, but they will go on something called NPD, Nielsen Book Scan. They'll look up the author's prior sales track,
Right.
and they'll kind of decide what kind of offer they want to make based on that. Obviously, the information there is not always complete because the publisher themselves will have the most complete numbers.
Right.
And it doesn't account for things like ebook sales and some stuff, special sales and things like that. So I've had instances where I've presented sales numbers to publishers, and normally they can either, because those figures are given to me by publishers.
Right.
Normally, the publisher can cross-reference those numbers with Nielsen Book Scan and see that, okay, only nominally more, reported by the publisher, obviously, because, they have the most accurate sales figures, the publisher, not Nielsen. What I have experienced was, an editor who told me there are sometimes, and I don't know if they participate in this kind of practice or not, editors who call up other editors at other publishing houses, and basically they trade insider information. They ask, hey, Nielsen's only telling me this. Can you give me the actual sales figures? Which, I mean, I feel like it's a step away from, again, it's like insider trading, These companies, they're separate companies. There should be a Chinese wall there, but there always isn't always, So, and you can't, it's almost like when you ask someone to sign an NDA or something, there's no stopping pillow talk. So,
Right.
if people have like a friend or relation or whatever at another publishing house, it's hard to stop that, especially if they don't do it in writing, they do it over the phone. But it's really a questionable practice if you ask me. And so when I heard that, I hoped it was just that one person and not a widespread practice or a practice that goes on at any one.
Yeah, it's not one that I'm aware of going on regularly, and certainly not one that we've engaged in, but who knows? I mean, behind closed
publishing's
doors,
great about getting themselves into antitrust issues and problems with the government over price fixing with Apple and Amazon. It would amaze me, that they would be foolish enough to do something like that too, which is even more blatant.
I agree. So what about marketing? What do you think an author differences in companies? Again, I don't name companies, but what should an author, a debut author, expect their publisher to do for marketing of them and their book? And I'm assuming that varies greatly by publisher too.
It varies greatly by publisher, and there are other factors that go into it. Basically, an author should be a willing participant, I think, no matter what. Those days of like, I've written the book and I've sent it off and now I'm done, I'm writing the next book are over, because with social media, people want and expect to hear from authors. Publishers really need their help because they're strapped for cash and they need authors to be putting themselves out there as much as they can. And what the publisher can do in terms of marketing and promoting a book, I tend to find, just from sitting on this side of the table, that it could, across the board, could always be better. In certain places, you see my dog Waffle.
Yes, very cute.
She's waking up from a nap. That's what it is.
Right on.
But some publishers could do this stuff, I think, in a smarter way. So I always say to clients, look, our best bet is don't just count on the publisher. Obviously, let's get a hold of their marketing and publicity plans. Try to, in the spirit of success, comment and improve upon those plans with the publisher. Let's work with the publisher to make the plans actionable, make them work. And then at the same time, do whatever you can on your own. Here's some recommendations, we give the publisher some recommendations. And some authors go as far as to hire an outside book publicist, which I don't always recommend because it's expensive, but in rare instances, I've seen folks do that. And those people work in concert with the publishing companies. What I have seen, which is kind of unfortunate, is sometimes there's a direct correlation between what a publisher has paid for a book and how they want to market the book.
Got it.
And that's tied into how many copies they've printed, because I think you know this probably from being within a publishing company as well, you know, in addition to being an author. So you've experienced this probably from multiple directions, or will be when the book comes out. You know, I'm sure the first thing the publishers are saying when they walk into, you know, one of their meetings is, okay, we just paid a ton of money for this book. How are we making our investment back? But the conversation should really be, I think, coming from the editors, not so much the bean counters or the salespeople saying something like that. I think it should be coming from the editor saying, these are the most amazing books. This is why I love these books. These are the best written books. Let's support these books. Because if we do, it's like following your heart or doing something you love. You'll be infinitely more successful at it. Instead, it's such a numbers game that they want to market and promote only the books which they paid the most money for or have the largest printings, because they're worried about meeting their bottom line. And yes, I can understand that to a certain extent, but I think it's also where you can, you know, following your passion in a way. That was always, I think, a better guiding light in publishing than, you know, the numbers, the data people. And so that's why whenever I hear people say this popular expression is something I've been seeing all over Twitter, all over online, people were saying best-selling authors are bestsellers because they are bestsellers. What that really means is they're bestsellers because they somehow managed to establish themselves as a best-selling author. They continue in that trajectory because the publisher is continually paying that kind of money and printing that number of books, and therefore having to market and promote it accordingly, regardless of good writing, bad writing, good storytelling, bad storytelling, or what. It's just, this author's a bestseller. It's going to sell. We need to make our investment back. And so it's very rote in that way.
Okay. Well, I think that my personal opinion is that every publisher, I agree with you, every publisher is in business to make money. And so they certainly, for those books that they pay more for, they've got to do what they have to do to recoup their investment and hopefully make money. Couldn't disagree with that at all. I think what's important, though, is that publishers, and I'm speaking now as both an author and a publisher, have to pay attention to every book they put out, and that those that they don't pay as much for, they still need to put enough marketing into them to give them an opportunity to succeed.
Yes, you don't want it to be a lost opportunity.
Right.
I mean, that's the whole phenomenon with Dan Brown was no one knew where the Da Vinci Code came from. You know, when the Da Vinci Code came out, publishers were scrambling to go back into their backlist, find a similar book they could republish. They couldn't find anything. So what happened was they were trying to make similar books of their own, and also figure out how could Dan Brown, who was just kind of a mid-list author who followed his editor, Jason Kaufman, from publishing house to publishing house as he moved from, you know, Macmillan to HarperCollins to Penguin Random House. How did this happen? And what they discovered was when they went back into their backlist, there was a big readership among people who were obsessed with reading about conspiracies in the Catholic Church concerning Mary Magdalene. But there were no books serving that big readership in the fiction space. There was no Catholic Church conspiracy books like that. Okay. And Dan Brown, you know, without meaning to, and no one was marketing him in a big way, wrote that book, served a huge underrepresented audience, and it became like the ultimate water cooler conversation, that book. So really by no help from the publisher, but I would argue, because a lot of his earlier books are fantastic, and I think one or two of them have been made into movies as well, and they later became bestsellers because the publisher went back and pushed those books. But I think if the way the editor was betting, the way Jason Kaufman was betting on Dan Brown, the author. If the publisher had been betting in the same way, we would have had a bigger success from Dan Brown, I think, before the Da Vinci Code. Mm-hmm. Or we might have just had other successes along the way, and it would have made his road to success a lot easier anyway.
Yep. So I have three more questions for you. The first one is pen names. What is your advice on pen names?
You know, I see authors do it for different reasons. Sometimes, you know, authors want to separate out their brands. Like, I can understand if someone was writing, you know, horror books or women's fiction, they want to separate that out from writing their children's books, because parents, you know, kind of want separate worlds with that stuff. And so I can easily understand an author who, for the sake of the brand, they want different names. I've seen a lot of authors who want to use pen names because maybe, you know, go back to the example of the publisher who overpaid for the debut, which couldn't live up to that unreasonable expected success. Like, you know, that author has to go and probably use a pen name the second time around to convince bookstores to carry the book.
Right.
I think what's tricky with all this stuff now compared to before is, in the past, usually only like the author, the agent, the publisher were in on the secret. Obviously, the publisher knows because they get a W-9, someone has to sign the contract. Right. They're going to know eventually. There are clever ways you can disguise that fact, right, and potentially keep it from a publisher, but I think they will find out anyway. But now with the internet age, I think it's even harder to keep that stuff a secret. And so where we go to publishers and say, hey, this author's willing to do this as a debut, not a debut, under a pen name, I usually say, you know, this is a pen name, and, you know, if you want, we can talk about what that means or why we're thinking of doing that and see what makes sense. But I try to be upfront about that as possible.
Yeah, well, in this day and age, when as you had said earlier, the author needs to be a marketer as well, not just a writer, and especially if they have an interesting background, it makes it harder to capitalize on that if they're writing under a pseudonym, because it's not the real them you can talk about in a way.
Yeah, it's like having to create a whole new brand, start from scratch. And I really think it would be better if publishers just went back to believing in authors and said to themselves, okay, if the first book didn't work out, maybe the second will.
Right.
Or even if the first book's a success, but the second one's not, well, that was a bump in the road. Let's hope the third book is a success.
Well, you know, I totally agree with you. And I go back to the music industry. You know, we put out many debut recording artists where we used the first album to establish them and knew we weren't going to make a lot of money on it, but we were setting up the second and third album, which we expect more than make up for what we didn't make on the first album. And sometimes that happens when a publisher signs a series and multiple books in one contract. But I don't think we're living in an immediate gratification age these days. That's part of the problem.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not, you know, there's a lot of magic to what we do, you know, and it's not an alchemy, and it's not like one and done, you know. Right. It doesn't really go that way. And it goes back to the thing I was saying about like the lawyers. Like, they do work, they get paid. They do work, they get paid. Sometimes in our industry, we do work, it doesn't pan out, but sometimes it does in a really big and meaningful way, and that's great. And we try to replicate those successes. But yeah.
Well, I've got to tell you, I'm pleased, and I will put in a plug here for Blackstone, but I'm pleased because I think our philosophy and our corporate culture is that we sign authors as much as we sign books. And I enjoy working in that kind of an atmosphere.
That's a rarity in our industry, and it's a good thing. And it's like one of the things that's like, it's really an evergreen that will, I think, sustain authors and publishers and hopefully the industry as a whole. And like, what's great about Blackstone too, as a publisher, you know, it also, just as an aside, is they've always been, originally they had, you know, their beginnings as an audio publisher, and they made the very best audiobooks as an independent publisher, some of the finest recordings. They always sought out the best narrators, you know, really worked with the authors on the cover and the narrations, and just made quality recordings. And I feel like they, in like making a new venture into not just you know, the audio space, but into the world of print and ebooks, like, are bringing kind of the same things to the table in a lot of ways. So it's a really good thing. I mean, hey, you go on Publishers Lunch and look at like the number of deals, and like regularly it's like Blackstone is always buying a ton of fiction and debut fiction, and doing really interesting and savvy things. Like, I couldn't believe, for instance, that Penguin Random House, I think that was the original publisher, had let James Clavell's Shogun go out of print. I mean, it's like, it's a classic, and there's a TV show, and like probably just a matter of time before they do another, you know, movie like that. Like, when I was like, how could that happen? I remember reading that book and watching the TV show and loving that. And so when I saw you guys scooped it up right away, like, I thought that was very smart of you all. And so
thank you. I actually am the person who acquired the Clavell catalog for Blackstone. I do want to correct you. It was never out of print.
Oh, okay.
But I think their contract ended, and they were just looking to see who might be the best fit for the future. And there is a new Shogun miniseries that's being filmed right now. So, and that'll be,
I'll be watching that then.
You and me both. I'm a huge Clavell fan. I mean, it was just, you know, it's like when you sign your idols, there's nothing better than that, even though it was dealing with his family rather than him personally, obviously. Rejection. I get a lot of would-be authors, or authors, I shouldn't say would-be authors, say authors who don't have deals or a thing of self-publishing. They talk about rejection, and you know, that they just, I get the feeling a lot of people can't deal with rejection, and yet at the same time, I know Harry Potter was rejected, and I know Stephen King was rejected, and in the music industry, Barbara Streisand was rejected. I mean, it seems to me it comes with the territory to some degree. Do you have a feeling about that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, I used to do this Japanese fencing called kendo.
Oh, really?
It's probably why I really liked reading Shogun. And whenever like the sensei or the instructor would just receive blows from you and, you know, not interact with you, you felt like you weren't getting something from it, getting something out of it. But when he gave you constructive criticism, or gave you something to work on or work with, like, that showed he cared. And I think if someone takes the time to write your response, share some thoughts, like, really hang on to that and try to do something meaningful with that. I think it's just a part of learning and growing. And I think that obviously there are a lot of authors like the ones you mentioned, or creators and musicians and people like that, who they probably look at their old rejection letters and smile and nod, you know, because it's such a subjective business. Yep. Someone could say, like, why is the Mona Lisa hanging in the Louvre? And someone else could say, are you crazy? That's the Mona Lisa.
Right.
So, you know, not everyone will always know best. And I think the good thing about it is it thickens your skin in a lot of ways. And yeah, it gives you something to work on. I don't know, but it's an unfortunate sometimes byproduct of the road to success, which is never straight. It's never smooth.
Right. And you're right. And we're in an industry where, I'll call it an industry, it is, where it is subjective, and it is dealing with art, and all art, whether it's film, paintings, books, music, it's all subjective. What one person loves, another may hate, but that's when you're dealing in the arts, that's what you're dealing with. It's different than counting numbers and they all add up to the same thing every time you count them.
Yeah, it's not, it's not like, you know, this is a pen and this pen is worth, you know, I don't know, 25 cents or whatever.
Right.
It's not that. It does.
Right.
The inherent value is not always so obvious or easy to see.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not selling widgets.
Right.
So what, to wrap up, before I do my final goodbye, do you have a number one tip or tips that you'd like to impart to aspiring writers?
Well, I think we were scratching at that surface a little bit, you know, with the in talking about the rejections. I think like in our industry, you've got to have grit, you know, and it's not just like the thick skin or any of that, but the willingness to keep going and not just be willing to look at the horizon or see what's on the horizon, but imagine what could be on the other side of the horizon. And that should really be, you know, the thing to keep you going.
Well, great. I agree with you 100%. I really appreciate you doing this. I think a lot of what you said has been going to be very helpful to a lot of people. It's certainly been enjoyable for me. I love dealing with you all the time, but this has been a really special conversation. And for those of you who've seen it, I hope you have enjoyed this conversation with Mark Gottlieb. And if you did, if you would press my logo and the bell and subscribe to the channel, that way you won't miss any more wonderful future chapter and verse episodes, some of which will include Mark's authors and others as well. And thank you again for doing this. I think it's been really great. Thank you.
This is wonderful. And thank you for what you do for authors and the publishing industry.
Well, thank you. And you as well. Great. Thanks, Mark.